Hi everyone, it's Shay here, and I'm going to be talking about my Module 2 Practices Erosion Bottle experiment that I created. So first I found my next generation science standard that I thought best aligned to this experiment and activity, and it was to make observations and or measurements to provide evidence of the effects of weathering or the rate of erosion by water, ice, wind, or vegetation. I did also include the table that was on the Next Generation Science Standards website, and I thought it was interesting that they specifically mentioned that the standard was developed from the framework for K-12 science education. I thought it just showed and really demonstrated how closely the two are related. And I also like that it really specifically demonstrates the integration of science and engineering practices, the integration of various science domains, and it even incorporates some ELA concepts such as cause and effect. So I thought it could be great to even incorporate a writing exercise talking about the cause and effect of erosion and weathering. So whenever I started to imagine for this this experiment, I first started to think about the materials that I had available to me around my house and how I would construct those materials to make my experiment and my prototype. And I also really carefully looked at the experiment designs that were provided to us as options in the module resources. So looking at that PDF of the step-by-step design and the video that was linked as well, showing the experiment in action. And I also thought about some potential problems that I might encounter in terms of, the different outdoor materials that I might need, such as the soil and the grass and the mulch and things like that. In planning my design, I was able to find some plastic bottles, and I've been saving these up in order to have enough and to use them for this experiment. And I was fortunate to have mulch and dirt and grass available to me outside my house, so I was able to grab some of that to use for the experiment as well. In terms of cutting the bottles, I was able to use a marker to kind of draw the area where I wanted to cut, and then was able to use scissors, and if I was having trouble, I did use a box cutter for some of this as well. On the next page, you'll see that in addition to these plastic bottles with the screw-on lids, like I saw in the designs that were provided to us, my love of coffee also served me well for this experiment because I was able to save up some Starbucks and Dunkin' plastic cups and attach those with some orange ribbon that I had lying around for different gift wrapping and things like that in order to catch the water as part of the experiment. At first, I was planning to use red Solo cups to catch the water. But luckily, I was able to save up enough of these clear coffee cups, which really did work better in order to see the water as it drained out of the bottles. Otherwise, it would have been much more difficult to see just how dirty or just how cloudy the water was, especially for some of the cups where you see that there's kind of sediment that settles to the bottom at the end of the experiment. So in creating my design, I had my mulch bottle on the left-hand side. My just dirt was in the middle and grass was on the right-hand side. They are in a different order in that top middle picture before I actually conducted the experiment, but you can see that they're the same once the cups are hanging off the end and once I had drained the water through the bottles into the clear plastic cups. And then thinking about some improvements that I could make to this experiment. So as you can see, the left-hand side, but the clearest water was actually the water that was drained through the mulch. And I think why this happened was that I didn't really have a lot of dirt below, a lot of soil below the mulch, and so I think that's why it is relatively clear. You can see that there's some larger pieces of bark and dirt and mulch kind of on the sides of the cup and floating at the top, and there's even some draining to the bottom there. On the right-hand side is the cup that was draining, or the water that was draining through the grass. And looking at this, I went back and rewatched the video of the gentleman who did the same experiment, and looking at his bottle that had grass in it, his grass was much deeper in the bottle. And so really the water was draining through the grass, the roots of the grass itself. Looking at my bottle, the soil was much higher compared to how tall the grass was. So I think a lot more of the dirt was draining out instead of having the water drain through the grass. So that's something I would change if I was to repeat this experiment again. And you can see that the dirtiest water was the water drained just through the soil itself. One more improvement that I would make to this experiment is you can see on the picture on the left-hand side that because I cut the bottles, the way that I cut the bottles, a lot of the water was actually spilling out the sides of the bottles onto the top of my table. I think this is because in order for the water to drain out the front of the opening of the bottle, you had to fill the water up high enough that it could reach the point where it would drain out at the top. And so I would factor that in next time and cut the bottles a little less shallow, so that it wasn't spilling out the sides, because it really could have affected the results of the experiment as well. And thinking about doing this with my students, I think it would be really interesting to repeat this experiment with them, but also to talk about some of the other types of land covered in the simulation that we did as part of this module. I think my students would be really interested to see how erosion and how the water and the effects of the experiment would change if we tried to replicate some of those different types of land, such as, the developed land or the desert or things like that. And then finally, looking at the connections among STEM practices. So for science, students would have to ask questions. They would have to plan and carry out investigations for both science and engineering. They would have to analyze and interpret the data that they gathered. And then students would have to construct explanations in order to explain the results of the experiment and why they came out the way they did. They would have to obtain, evaluate, and communicate information similarly to that construct explanations as well. For technology, I thought it could be interesting to discuss the role that technology plays in the advancement of science and engineering, and the simulation of the different types of land and the erosion and weathering that occurred would be a great way to do this, incorporating the technology so students could see what's happening in those different areas that we can't, naturally observe right outside our classroom windows. And something else interesting to discuss would be, talk about, as we are, developing different lands and new technology is occurring, how is that affecting the environment and how is that influencing things like weathering and erosion? And then for mathematics, I thought that students could use appropriate tools strategically. So in thinking about cutting the bottles and the ribbon and things like that, making sure that they're using things like a ruler or a measuring tape to make sure that those measurements are precise. And then students could also be using measuring cups in order to measure liquid volume as part of this experiment.